a sharp retired lawyer living peacefully in her suburban home, a tech-savvy granddaughter determined to keep her grandmother safe, a team of manipulative scammers lurking in the shadows, ready to strike. Together, they hatch a plan that will turn the tables and bring the fraudsters down. Helen Stevenson had always been a woman of sharp wit and unwavering independence. Now in her 70s, she found herself living alone in the quiet suburban neighborhood she had called home for decades. Her house was modest but full of memories. The creaky front porch where she'd sit with her coffee in the mornings, the well-tended garden she proudly maintained, and the many bookshelves crammed with volumes on everything from law to literature. She no longer worked, but the years she spent as a criminal defense lawyer had shaped her into a keen observer of people and situations, a skill she still used to this day. On a crisp autumn morning, Helen was in the middle of her usual routine. She had already walked to the local bakery for her morning croissant, greeted the neighbors as they walked their dogs, and now she was sitting at her kitchen table, her laptop open in front of her. Helen wasn't particularly tech-savvy, but after years of necessity, she had become comfortable enough to handle the basics. Checking her emails, reading the news, and video calling her children had become second nature. Today, she was enjoying a quiet cup of tea when the phone rang.
Hello?
She answered, her voice smooth and steady as always.
Good morning, Mrs. Stevenson.
A smooth, overly polite voice came over the line.
This is David from Tech Support Solutions. We've detected a severe virus on your computer that's currently threatening your security. It's very important that we address this immediately.
Helen's brow furrowed as she took another sip of tea.
A virus, you say? What sort of virus are we talking about?
The kind that can steal all your personal data, including bank information.
The man replied with urgency.
We've already been alerted by our monitoring system, and we need you to grant us remote access so we can fix it right away. Otherwise, you might lose your data permanently.
Helen paused, her experience as a lawyer making her cautious. In her line of work, she'd encountered countless scams, people trying to take advantage of others' trust or ignorance. Her first instinct was to decline, but something about the voice on the other end was disarmingly calm. The man spoke with a confidence that made it difficult to immediately dismiss.
I'm sorry.
Helen said, her voice firm.
I'm not giving anyone access to my computer without more information.
I understand your concern, Mrs. Stevenson,
The man responded smoothly.
but time is of the essence. If you don't act now, your computer will become completely compromised. We can walk you through the process of securing your system.
Helen thought for a moment. She was reluctant, but something about the call made her pause. What if this was real? After all, she had heard of people having their computers attacked by viruses. Her hand hovered over the mouse. Before she could make up her mind, the doorbell rang, breaking her train of thought.
Excuse me.
She said, setting the phone down for a moment. She went to the front door, half expecting it to be a neighbor dropping by. To her surprise, it was her granddaughter, Emma, standing on the porch with a wide grin. Emma was in her late 20s, tech-savvy and always in tune with the latest trends. She had been visiting Helen more frequently lately, and Helen loved the time they spent together, even though they couldn't be more different in some ways. Helen was grounded in tradition, enjoying the quiet pace of life, while Emma was always up to date with the fast-moving digital world. Their differing perspectives complemented each other, Emma bringing energy and modernity to Helen's more reflective, slower-paced lifestyle.
Grandma, I brought you lunch.
Emma said brightly, holding up a bag with takeout from their favorite deli.
I thought we could hang out and catch up.
Helen smiled, stepping aside to let her in.
I'd love that. Just give me a moment. There's something strange going on with my computer.
Emma raised an eyebrow as she followed her grandmother to the kitchen. Helen picked up the phone again, but her expression had changed. Her instinct for caution had kicked in, and she was beginning to feel a little more uneasy.
Sorry, David, I'll have to call you back.
Helen said politely but firmly.
What's going on, Grandma?
Emma asked, setting the bag of food on the counter. She noticed the hesitation in Helen's demeanor and the way she was gripping the phone a little too tightly. Helen paused, not sure how much to share.
I got a call from some tech support company. They say there's a virus on my computer and they need access to fix it. But something about it doesn't sit right.
Emma's eyes narrowed.
A virus, huh? That sounds like one of those scams where they trick people into giving up their personal information. Let me take a look.
Helen handed her the phone. Emma's fingers were already flying over her smartphone as she began to look up the number that had called. Within moments, she had found a trail of complaints online about the same company. It was, as she suspected, a scam designed to exploit vulnerable people.
Grandma, you're right to be suspicious.
Emma said, her voice filled with both concern and relief.
This is a scam. You didn't give them any access, did you?
Helen shook her head.
Not yet, but I was close. They sounded so convincing.
Emma smiled and sat down next to her grandmother.
You were right to be cautious. Let's figure out how to block them from calling again. I can help you report them to the right people.
Helen sighed, feeling a little embarrassed, but also grateful for her granddaughter's quick thinking.
I suppose my instincts aren't as sharp as they used to be. But I'm glad you showed up when you did.
I've got your back, Grandma.
Emma said with a smile.
Let's take care of this and grab some lunch. You've earned it.
As they sat down together to eat, Helen reflected on how grateful she was for Emma's presence. The old woman might have been more vulnerable in the face of modern scams, but with Emma by her side, she knew she wasn't alone. The digital age might present new challenges, but it also offered the chance for generations to come together and tackle problems in new ways. And as she looked at Emma, Helen realized that the old adage was true. It was never too late to learn something new. The following week, Helen began receiving calls from the same number again. Each time, the voice on the other end was calm, reassuring, and persistent. At first, Helen had been able to dismiss the calls, but now they seemed harder to ignore. It wasn't the urgency in the voice that tugged at her. It was the details they gave her about her computer.
Good afternoon, Mrs. Stevenson. This is David from Tech Support Solutions. We've detected suspicious activity on your computer, and we need to act quickly to prevent further damage. Your system is vulnerable to hackers, and if you don't resolve it today, it could cost you your personal data.
Helen was sitting at her kitchen table, sipping her afternoon tea, when the call came through. She glanced at the caller ID, recognizing the number from the previous conversations. Her instincts, always sharp when it came to the law, told her something was off. Yet as she picked up the receiver, the polite, professional tone of David's voice disarmed her.
I understand your concerns, Mrs. Stevenson. We've been monitoring your system for a while, and we can see some unusual activity. Let's resolve this immediately.
Unusual activity?
Helen repeated, feeling a flicker of doubt. Her computer was old, but she didn't think it was anything more than the occasional slowdown due to its age. Still, there was something unnerving about the man's certainty.
We'll need remote access to your computer.
He continued smoothly.
We can guide you through the process, and it will only take a few minutes. You won't even have to do much. Just follow my instructions.
Helen hesitated. She had always been cautious with her personal information, but she wasn't a technophobe. Over the years, she had learned to navigate her computer, checking her emails, browsing the web, and even keeping in touch with family. But the idea of giving someone remote access to her computer felt invasive.
I don't know.
Helen began, but the man cut in before she could voice her concern.
I completely understand your hesitancy, Mrs. Stevenson.
David said, his voice warm and sincere.
But you need to understand how serious this is. We've already detected malware on your system that's been tracking your activity. If you don't fix it soon, you might lose everything. Your documents, emails, even your bank account details. The risk is just too high.
Helen felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She didn't want to be paranoid, but the urgency in David's voice seemed to tap into her deepest fears. She didn't want to lose her personal information. The idea of something as personal as her bank account, details being at risk, was enough to make her pulse quicken.
Okay.
She muttered almost to herself.
What do I need to do?
David, sensing her vulnerability, walked her through the process step by step. He told her to open a program she had never used before, something called a remote desktop application. Helen's fingers hovered over the keyboard. It felt odd to be following instructions from a stranger like this, but at the same time, The thought of losing everything was even more unsettling. The man's confidence reassured her, and soon enough, Helen had given the program permission to install. She watched as the cursor on her screen moved by itself, following the man's unseen direction.
Just a few more minutes, Mrs. Stevenson.
David said.
We're almost done. You'll see how much safer your system will be once we're finished.
The next few minutes were a blur. David's calming words filled the silence as Helen sat back, feeling both foolish and relieved at the same time. She was letting someone into her computer, but they seemed so knowledgeable, so professional. Surely they wouldn't take advantage of her, would they? As soon as the call ended, Helen leaned back in her chair, exhausted by the experience. But the nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right refused to leave her. She had followed the instructions, yes, but the entire exchange felt too smooth, too easy. The next few days, Helen couldn't shake the feeling that she had done something wrong. Meanwhile, Emma began to notice the strange pattern of calls. She had come over to visit her grandmother several times since that first conversation, and each time, Helen mentioned the tech support issue. At first, Emma had dismissed it, thinking it was just a minor misunderstanding. But as the calls continued, Emma's concerns grew. Her grandmother wasn't one to fall for scams. Helen had lived through decades of legal battles and had an innate understanding of human behavior. Yet the persistence of these calls seemed to be wearing her down. One afternoon, Emma sat in the living room with her laptop, watching her grandmother as she answered another call. Helen, holding the phone with a somewhat strained expression, seemed to be caught in the middle of a conversation with David once again. She was trying to make sense of what he was saying, nodding and murmuring in agreement. Emma's suspicion flared. She had overheard enough of these calls to recognize the pattern, the urgency, the technical jargon, and the repetition of the same script. It all pointed to one thing. This was a scam. She stood up and walked over to her grandmother.
Grandma, can I talk to you for a second?
Helen waved her off, clearly distracted.
Emma, not now, dear. I'm talking to David from tech support. I'm almost done.
Emma didn't wait. She grabbed the phone gently from Helen's hand and addressed the caller, who was mid-sentence.
I'm sorry, but I don't think you should be calling my grandmother.
Emma said coolly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who knew what they were doing. The line went silent for a moment before the man on the other end cleared his throat.
Excuse me, miss. I believe you have no right to interfere.
I know exactly what's going on here.
Emma interrupted.
You've been calling her repeatedly, and I don't appreciate you trying to scam her. You're going to stop right now.
Helen watched, confused and somewhat startled by Emma's boldness. When the line went dead, Emma handed the phone back to her grandmother.
Grandma, they're scammers. They've been trying to get your personal information. I'm going to check this out, okay?
Helen blinked, still processing.
But they seemed so professional. I thought they were trying to help.
Emma's face softened as she sat next to her grandmother.
I know you want to be helpful, but they're not here to help you. They're just trying to get your money or access to your personal information. I'll take care of it. Don't worry.
Helen felt a mix of embarrassment and relief wash over her. She had trusted her instincts, but the scammers had been clever. Too clever for her to catch on alone. Emma's sharp mind, however, had seen right through the ruse. It was time for the two of them to put their heads together and put an end to this before it went any further. Helen sat at her kitchen table, the soft hum of her laptop filling the silence as she flipped through her old case notes. It had been years since she'd worked in the criminal defense world, but the investigative skills she'd honed over decades hadn't left her. This time, though, her target wasn't a criminal defendant. It was a network of scammers trying to exploit her. But that didn't mean she wouldn't use every tool in her legal arsenal. With a pad of paper and a pen, Helen began to jot down everything she could remember about her interactions with the scammers. She noted dates, times, phrases, and every inconsistency or contradiction in the things they said. Her sharp mind was already piecing together patterns, much like she used to do when preparing a defense or crafting an argument in the courtroom. If there was a crack in their story, she would find it.
Grandma, I'm going to look into their number again.
Emma said from the living room, her voice breaking Helen's concentration.
We can't let this slip through the cracks.
Helen looked up, a smile tugging at her lips. Emma was always so focused and diligent, like a digital detective. The two of them made a formidable team. Helen with her legal acumen and Emma with her tech-savvy mind. Together, they would turn the tables on these criminals,
I'm thinking the same thing.
Helen replied.
We need to be methodical about this. Every little detail counts.
The phone calls had continued, but now Helen was better prepared. She recognized the patterns in the way the scammers operated, how they manipulated her emotions, how they used urgency and technical jargon to obscure their true intentions. But the more they spoke, the more Helen noticed the cracks in their story. They would contradict themselves or repeat the same phrases, trying to lull her into a sense of false security. She'd been a lawyer long enough to see through such tactics. As she took notes, Emma returned to the room with a frown.
This number's definitely been reported before.
She said, tapping her phone screen.
It's associated with a number of scam complaints, but it's hard to trace. I'm digging deeper, though.
Helen nodded, already thinking ahead.
That's a good start. We can't trust what they're telling us, so we need to play along. The goal is to learn as much as we can about them and how they operate.
Emma's eyes brightened.
You mean we're going to keep pretending like we don't know what they're doing?
Helen gave her a look.
Exactly. We string them along by some time. I'll get them to reveal more details while you keep working the tech side. Together we'll expose them.
Emma looked impressed.
I like it. Let's do it.
For the next few days, Helen and Emma set their plan into motion. Helen took the lead when it came to dealing with the scammers, using her patience and experience in handling difficult people. Every time they called, she answered, her tone polite but firm. She would listen to their spiel, making a show of being concerned, all while mentally keeping track of their inconsistencies.
We're still monitoring your system, Mrs. Stevenson.
David said one morning, the familiar voice on the other end of the line.
We've detected more suspicious activity. It's important you let us fix this right away. It could escalate if left unchecked.
Helen's mind worked quickly, recognizing the repeated nature of the conversation.
Of course,
She replied, her voice steady.
you've told me this before. What exactly is the nature of the virus again?
David faltered.
As I said, it's a sophisticated form of malware that can track personal information.
Helen knew better than to press too hard at that moment, so she casually mentioned a few of the things she had learned about computer security over the years.
You know, I read about some antivirus software that can handle these kinds of viruses. I was thinking of using it instead. What do you think?
There was a brief silence before David responded.
It's not recommended, Mrs. Stevenson. Our team has the specific tools and knowledge to eradicate this particular type of virus. You need to trust us on this.
It was almost too easy. Helen made a note of his discomfort with the question about antivirus software. He didn't want her to take control, to explore alternatives. That was a red flag. Meanwhile, Emma worked in the background, using her skills to dig deeper into the scammer's digital footprint. She traced the phone number, pieced together email addresses, and searched online forums for reports of similar scams. It didn't take long for her to uncover a trail of complaints from other people who had fallen victim to the same tactics. Emma cross-referenced details from the scammer's communications with reports, matching specific phrases and company names.
What do you think, Grandma?
Emma asked one evening, sitting down beside her at the table.
I found something interesting.
Helen glanced at her granddaughter.
What is it?
Emma pulled up a map on her phone.
There's a pattern. The same number has been used across several states, usually tied to high-volume scams. And here's the kicker. The email addresses they're using are linked to a network of fraudulent companies. These guys are part of a much bigger operation.
Helen's eyes narrowed.
So they're not working alone?
Emma shook her head.
No, this is a larger fraud network. If we can track down enough evidence, we might be able to report it to the authorities and stop them before they scam anyone else.
Helen took a deep breath, her lawyer's mind shifting into high gear.
We need more information. We have to build a case. I want everything we can get. Phone records, email logs, anything that ties them to their operation. And we need to be careful. If they sense we're on to them, they might back off.
Together, they dug deeper. They traced the scammers' use of remote desktop software, identified IP addresses, and started collecting other critical details. Helen continued her conversations with the scammers, carefully steering the dialogue to extract more information about the supposed company and their practices. Each conversation, though exasperating, brought them closer to uncovering the truth. Emma, in turn, focused on getting the technical evidence that would link the fraudsters to their larger network. They were building a case, piece by piece, without tipping off their targets. As the days passed, they began to see the full scope of the scam. The scammers were part of a sophisticated operation, preying on people like Helen, who weren't entirely comfortable with technology, but still needed help with their computers. Their tactics were subtle, but their goal was always the same: access to sensitive information, which they could either sell or use for further theft. Helen's experience as a criminal defense lawyer had taught her that even the most intricate scams could be unraveled with enough patience and attention to detail. The scammers had relied on their victims' lack of technical knowledge, but Helen and Emma were about to turn the tables. They had a plan now, and they weren't about to let the scammers win.
Let's move fast.
Helen said to Emma, a spark of determination in her eyes.
We've gathered enough to report this. Let's make sure no one else gets hurt.
Emma nodded.
Agreed. Let's put a stop to this.
Together, they were ready to take the next step, one that would expose the scammers for good and protect others from falling into the same trap. Emma sat in front of her computer, eyes fixed on the screen as she typed furiously. It had been several days since they'd set their plan into motion, and now they were getting closer to catching the scammers red-handed. Her fingers flew over the keys, tracing the digital breadcrumbs the scammers had left behind. They thought they were dealing with a naive grandmother, but they hadn't counted on Helen's sharp mind or Emma's technical expertise.
Got it.
Emma murmured to herself, clicking through a series of IP addresses that were linked to the scammers.
I can trace the email back to a central server. This is definitely a larger network.
Helen, sitting nearby, glanced over.
How big are we talking?
Emma's eyes narrowed in concentration.
This isn't just one or two guys making phone calls. This is a full-scale operation. I'm seeing links to several other numbers and email accounts, all part of the same group. If we can track this, we might even get a sense of where they're operating from.
Helen leaned forward, her legal mind already forming strategies.
We need to make sure we have enough evidence to tie everything together. If we're going to bring them down, we can't afford any loose ends.
Emma nodded, clicking through multiple tabs on her screen.
I'm setting up a digital trap. If they keep contacting us, I'll trace the calls and emails directly back to their location. I'll use a decoy email address to lure them in.
Helen smiled approvingly.
Good thinking. While you work on that, I'll reach out to some of my old colleagues. They might have access to resources that could help us build a stronger case.
Helen wasted no time. She picked up her phone and dialed a familiar number, one she hadn't called in years. The voice on the other end of the line was unmistakable.
Detective Richardson here.
Frank, it's Helen Stevenson.
Helen said, her voice steady.
I need a favor. You're going to think this is strange, but hear me out.
Detective Richardson, who had been a close contact during Helen's years as a criminal defense lawyer, didn't hesitate.
What's going on, Helen?
I've got a situation. My granddaughter and I are dealing with a tech support scam, one that seems to be connected to a much larger fraud network. I need some help tracking it down, but I can't do it alone.
There was a brief silence on the other end before Frank spoke again, his voice shifting to a more serious tone.
Tech support scams? You're telling me you're tangled up in this?
I am,
Helen confirmed.
but it's not just us. These scammers are targeting vulnerable people across the country, and they've got a well-organized system going. I need you to run some background checks, tap into some law enforcement resources. We've got the tech, but we need your help with the legal side of things.
Frank sighed.
You're lucky I don't have much going on right now. Let me see what I can do. Stay in touch, Helen. If you've got evidence, we'll work together on this.
Helen hung up the phone, feeling a surge of hope. She had the support of someone she trusted, someone who knew how to navigate the complexities of law enforcement. It was the perfect combination: her legal expertise, Emma's tech skills, and Frank's resources. Meanwhile, Emma was still deep in her work. She'd set up a decoy email account that appeared to be an interested customer, a lonely woman eager to resolve the computer issues that had been plaguing her. It was a perfect ruse. She'd lured them in with false promises, offering to pay for the services they were offering, all while keeping track of their every move. The scammer called almost immediately.
Good afternoon, Mrs. Harris.
The voice on the other end said, sounding cheerful and professional.
This is David from Tech Support Solutions. I see you've had some issues with your computer. I'm here to help resolve those for you.
Emma's heart raced as she played along.
Oh, thank you so much. My computer has been acting up and I don't know what to do. Can you help me fix it?
Of course, Mrs. Harris.
David said smoothly.
Now, the first thing we'll need to do is access your system remotely. We'll take care of everything from there.
Emma kept the conversation going, pretending to be a confused senior citizen, easily manipulated. She could hear David's confidence grow with each passing minute, as if he was already imagining the money he would make off her. While the conversation unfolded, Emma took careful note of the details, gathering information on the scammer's methods and background. She traced the call, monitoring the signals and IP addresses, while also gathering the email addresses associated with their communications. Each new piece of information was another thread in the growing web of evidence. Then, just as they had planned, Emma handed the collected information over to Helen, who contacted Detective Richardson.
Frank, we've got it all.
She said, a sense of finality in her voice.
I have the number, the emails, everything you need. It's time to take them down.
The scammer, confident that he was getting closer to his goal, pushed harder.
Mrs. Harris,
He said smoothly.
we've made all the necessary repairs to your computer. We just need you to confirm your payment. Once that's done, we can finalize everything.
Emma, still playing her part, hesitated on the phone, as if trying to buy time.
I'm not sure. Can't I pay later?
David's voice took on a sharper edge.
No, Mrs. Harris. If you don't pay now, we can't guarantee your system's safety. Your personal data will be at risk. We are talking about serious consequences here.
It was a textbook tactic, a pressure play meant to drive their victim into a panic. But Emma held her ground, pretending to be confused and unsure.
I understand, but I need a bit more time to think. Can I call you back in a few minutes?
David, sensing the window closing, pressed her for a quicker response.
I can't stress this enough, Mrs. Harris. Your safety is at risk. This must be dealt with immediately.
As he rambled on, Emma quietly ended the call. She had what they needed,
Well, Grandma, we've got them cornered now.
she said, hanging up the phone.
I've gathered all the data we need, and they're going to feel the heat soon.
Helen nodded, her calm demeanor masking the rush of adrenaline coursing through her veins.
It's time. I'll call Frank and let him know we're ready.
The next day, Detective Richardson called.
Helen, I've got the green light. We've traced the scammer's number to a location and we're moving forward with the operation. I'll have a team ready to take them down the next time they make contact.
Helen smiled.
Thanks, Frank. You're saving a lot of people from falling into this trap.
Hours later, the scammer called again, just as Helen had predicted. This time, however, the call was intercepted. A team of law enforcement agents swooped in, arresting David and his colleagues as they tried to contact Emma's decoy email account. Helen and Emma watched as the criminals were led away in handcuffs, their operation dismantled before they could cause any more harm. The scammers' confidence had been their downfall. They had underestimated the combined power of a sharp legal mind and a determined, tech-savvy granddaughter. As they watched the law enforcement agents carry out their work, Helen turned to Emma, a sense of pride swelling in her chest.
We did it, Emma. We stopped them.
Emma smiled, her eyes sparkling with satisfaction.
We sure did. And no one else will fall for their tricks.
The scammers' network had been exposed, dismantled, and broken, but the true victory lay in the fact that Helen and Emma had outwitted them, proving that intelligence, patience, and teamwork could overcome even the most sophisticated fraud schemes. And for Helen, it was a reminder that no matter what age you were, there was always a way to fight back. The sun was beginning to set over the quiet suburban neighborhood as Helen and Emma sat on the porch, a peaceful sense of satisfaction hanging in the air. The scam ring that had threatened to take advantage of Helen had been broken wide open. The scammers had been arrested, their operation dismantled. The law enforcement team, led by Helen's old colleague, Detective Frank Richardson, had swiftly moved in, gathering the necessary evidence to make the arrests. In just a few days, the fraudsters who had tried to exploit Helen had been caught in a coordinated effort that spanned across several states. The stolen funds, millions of dollars from unsuspecting victims, were being recovered and returned, one step at a time. Helen leaned back in her chair, her mind replaying the events that had unfolded in such a short amount of time. The relief she felt was palpable, but so was the quiet pride. It was a victory not just for her, but for all the victims who had been preyed upon. They had stood up to the scam and fought back. And now, thanks to their combined efforts, the criminals who had sought to profit off others' misery were behind bars.
I still can't believe they fell for it.
Emma said, watching the last light of day disappear over the horizon.
It all happened so fast.
Helen nodded.
They were too confident. They didn't think anyone would be smart enough to catch on. But we did.
Emma smiled.
We did. And now those victims will get some of their money back.
Helen's phone buzzed and she picked it up to find a message from Frank.
The operation's a success. We've got them all. Your work helped bring down a massive fraud ring. You should be proud.
I guess it's not often that a retired lawyer gets to bring down a scam operation,
Helen said, her voice tinged with amusement.
You were never just a retired lawyer, Grandma?
Emma replied, her tone filled with admiration.
You're still a force to be reckoned with.
With the scammers behind bars, Helen didn't take long to channel the energy from the victory into something bigger. She realized that while the legal system had worked in their favor, many other people still had no idea how to protect themselves from similar fraud schemes. She was determined to make sure that the lessons she'd learned didn't go to waste. The first step was reaching out to her community. Helen knew that people in her neighborhood, particularly seniors, were vulnerable to scams like the ones she'd faced. So she contacted the local community center and offered to host a series of workshops focused on fraud prevention. The center was more than happy to offer her space, and soon flyers were posted throughout the town. Helen's workshops became an instant success. Word spread quickly, and before long, people of all ages were showing up, eager to learn how to identify red flags in phone calls, emails, and online offers. Each session was a mix of practical advice, personal anecdotes, and a deep dive into the psychology of scammers. Helen's years as a criminal defense lawyer gave her a unique insight into how manipulation worked, and she shared her knowledge generously with the group.
It's not just about technology.
She told her audience during one of her workshops.
It's about understanding how scammers prey on your emotions, your trust, and your desire to help. The best defense is to stay skeptical and always verify before you act.
Emma, always at her side, helped with the technical aspects of the workshops. She set up a presentation system, walked participants through using online tools to check for fraud, and helped them navigate websites to report scams. But it wasn't just about showing them the technical side. Emma wanted to make sure they felt confident in using the information, no matter how unfamiliar the digital world might seem. Her patient explanations and hands-on approach made her an indispensable part of the workshops. Helen was thrilled with the response.
I never imagined I'd be doing something like this in my retirement.
She said to Emma one afternoon, after another full class.
But it feels good to know I'm making a difference.
Emma smiled back, admiring her grandmother's resilience.
You're amazing, Grandma. You've always been a fighter, even when you didn't realize it.
Helen's influence began to spread, and soon other community centers across the county contacted her to set up similar workshops. The more people she educated, the more her passion grew. She realized that it wasn't just about protecting herself or even just protecting her neighbors. It was about creating a ripple effect. If she could help just one person avoid falling victim to a scam, it was worth it. And by the looks of things, she was already helping dozens, if not hundreds. But Emma, too, was inspired by the work her grandmother had begun. As she assisted Helen with the workshops, she realized that this was a cause she wanted to dedicate herself to full-time. While the workshops had been effective, Emma saw a larger opportunity, something that could help protect seniors nationwide, not just in their local community. She decided to start her own nonprofit organization focused entirely on digital safety for older adults. The idea had been building for a while. Emma knew that the biggest barrier to combating scams in the digital age wasn't just a lack of awareness. It was the overwhelming sense of fear that came with trying to navigate a new world. Many seniors felt lost online, unable to discern trustworthy websites from malicious ones, and scared to use online banking or even email. Emma's nonprofit would aim to change that. She called the nonprofit Digital Defenders for Seniors, and her mission was clear: to empower older adults with the knowledge and confidence they needed to use the internet safely and securely. With Helen's guidance, Emma was able to build a team and create workshops, informational materials, and even online courses tailored to seniors. The nonprofit offered step-by-step guides on how to spot phishing attempts, how to secure personal devices, and how to report suspicious activity. Emma also worked with software companies to offer free or discounted antivirus and identity protection services to seniors who were at the highest risk. As Emma's nonprofit grew, so did her bond with her grandmother. Helen served as a trusted advisor, helping Emma develop programs, connecting her with other community leaders, and offering insights from her own experience with fraud prevention. Emma marveled at how much her grandmother had accomplished in such a short time and how much she was still learning. The entire experience had been a reminder of the power of determination, the value of learning new things, and the importance of helping others. The culmination of their work came at a community event held at the local community center. Helen and Emma stood side by side in front of a packed room, their faces beaming with pride. It was the culmination of months of hard work, work that had touched many lives in their town and beyond. The event was a celebration of everything they had achieved, a powerful community that had come together to protect themselves and each other. Seniors who had attended Helen's workshops shared their stories of how they had avoided scams. Volunteers from Digital Defenders for Seniors handed out informational pamphlets and signed people up for free consultations. It was a day of joy and hope, and Helen and Emma were at the heart of it all. As the event wound down, Helen took Emma's hand and looked out over the crowd of smiling, grateful faces.
We've done good, haven't we?
Helen said, her voice thick with emotion. Emma nodded, her heart full.
We've done more than good, Grandma. We've made a real difference.
Helen turned to Emma, her eyes twinkling.
You've taught me so much. It's never too late to make a difference, is it?
Emma smiled and squeezed her grandmother's hand.
No, it's never too late.
And as they looked out at the community they had helped protect, their bond grew even stronger. Together they had built a legacy of empowerment, resilience, and hope. One person could make a difference, but two people working together could change the world. And Helen and Emma were proof of that.